She came home carrying roses and a smile she'd been saving all week. She left carrying nothing but the sound of her own heartbreak echoing off marble floors. 8 years. Everything she had, everything she was, gone in the time it took him to say, "You don't belong beside the man I became." If you've ever loved someone so completely you forgot to love yourself, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Simone's journey to the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Mom. The anniversary gift had taken her 3 weeks to find. Simone Caldwell stood outside the gates of the Kong estate with a wrapped box in her hands and a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in months, maybe longer than she wanted to admit. The October air over Seoul carried the first real cold of the season, sharp enough to bite through her coat, and she could see her breath when she exhaled. The iron gates were already open. That should have told her something. She walked the stone path she'd walked 1,000 times, past the precision-trimmed hedges and the imported stone lanterns she had personally selected from a dealer in Kyoto 8 years ago. Back when everything they owned still meant something to both of them. Back when she could walk through that front door and feel like she lived there instead of just passing through. The house was quiet. That should have told her something too. Simone was 41 years old, and she was still, by any honest accounting, a striking woman. Tall, composed, with the kind of bearing that made people in rooms unconsciously straighten their posture when she walked in. She had built that presence deliberately over years of standing next to one of the most dangerous men in Asia, learning early that in Jaemin's world, weakness wasn't just dangerous. It was an invitation. So she had made herself someone no one could easily read. She had practiced until stillness became her default, until calm looked effortless even when her hands were shaking underneath the table. Tonight her hands weren't shaking. Tonight she felt almost light. She pushed open the front door with her hip and stepped into the foyer. The lights were dim. Not off. Dim. The kind of dim that wasn't accidental. She heard the sound before she fully registered what it meant. A laugh. Low, feminine. The particular frequency of a woman who did not know she was being heard. Simone stopped walking. The gift box was still in her arms. She could feel the ribbon against her wrist. She stood in the foyer of her own home and listened to a sound that rewired every circuit in her body, and she didn't move for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 4 seconds, maybe 5. She had known, somewhere below the level of words, for a while now. She had not known she knew. She walked toward the sound. The door to Jaemin's private sitting room, but the one she'd been subtly discouraged from entering without announcement for the past year, was not fully closed. It was ajar by about 6 inches. The warm light from inside fell across the hardwood floor of the hallway in a slanted rectangle, and inside that rectangle, Simone could see 2 sets of shoes. His. Black Oxfords, size 44, the ones she'd ordered from London, and a pair of beige pumps she didn't recognize. She pushed the door open. Kang Jae-min was 46 years old, and he had never been conventionally handsome. His face was all hard angles and the specific settled weight of a man who had never once in his adult life been unsure of where he stood in a room. His hair had gone mostly gray at the temples in the past 2 years, and it had only made him look more formidable, more permanent, like something carved out of the same material as the empire he'd built. He was sitting on the leather sofa, her sofa, the one she'd spent 3 hours choosing, with a glass of whiskey on the table in front of him. Beside him was a woman who couldn't have been older than 26, with the kind of careful beauty that suggested both good genetics and significant investment. Yuna Seo, his assistant, his very dedicated, always available, impossibly attentive assistant. They weren't touching when Simone walked in. They didn't need to be. Jaemin looked at her. Not the way a man looks at his wife when she catches him. Not with guilt. Not with the scrambling self-betrayal she'd seen on the faces of other men in situations like this. Situations she'd only heard about secondhand because she had believed, with a ferocity that now felt like the most expensive thing she'd ever paid for, that she would never be standing in one. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's finally decided to address. The anniversary gift hit the floor. She hadn't meant to drop it. Her fingers just stopped working. She heard the sound, a dull thud against hardwood, and didn't look down. Yuna stood. She was elegant about it, controlled, which told Simone something she filed away automatically even as her chest was coming apart. This was not a woman surprised by anything. This was a woman who had been told what to expect. You should go, Jaemin said to Yuna. Not a question, not an apology, a logistical instruction. Yuna picked up her bag and walked past Simone without making eye contact. Her shoulder came within inches of Simone's. She smelled like something expensive. She left without a word, and Simone heard the front door close 30 seconds later with a soft, definitive click. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Simone had ever heard. How long? She said. Her voice came out steady. She would be grateful for that later. Jaemin reached forward and picked up his whiskey glass. He turned it slowly in his fingers, looking at it rather than her. Sit down, Simone. I didn't ask you to tell me where to put my body. How long? He looked at her then. The whiskey glass went back down on the table. 3 years. 3 years. She had planned a party for Yuna's promotion 18 months ago. She had shaken the woman's hand. She had said genuinely that Jaemin was lucky to have such a capable team around him. She stood in her own memory now, watching herself say those words, and felt something cold and nauseating crawl through her stomach. I see, she said. Jaemin stood. He was taller than her by several inches, and he was the kind of man whose physical presence functioned almost like a separate tool in his arsenal, something he had learned to deploy with precision. He used it now, straightening to his full height, moving to stand near the window. There are papers in the study, he said. Prepared. My attorney will contact yours next week, but I wanted you to know tonight. She stared at him. Papers, she repeated. The divorce agreement. The division of assets is outlined. My team has been thorough. You'll be comfortable. Something happened in Simone's chest then that she couldn't name exactly. A compression, like a fist closing around the center of her ribcage. Later, she would recognize it as the specific sensation of a reality collapsing. But in the moment, she just stood there in the dim light of a room full of furniture she had chosen, in a house she had helped build into a home. And she listened to the man she had married say the word divorce, the way someone reads a line from a document they've already had reviewed. You prepared papers, she said slowly. You had an attorney prepare papers. Months ago, yes. While I was... Simone. His voice had that quality it got when he felt a conversation was becoming inefficient. She had heard that voice in 100 negotiations. She had watched it make grown men shrink. This is not a moment for... While I was what, Jaemin? While I was living in this house? While I was attending your meetings and sitting at your tables and defending your name to people who questioned whether you were worth trusting? He turned from the window. His expression was not cruel exactly. It was something worse. It was settled. At peace. The expression of a man delivering a decision he had thoroughly processed and moved past without her. You helped me become what I am, he said. I've never denied that. But the man I am now requires someone different beside him. She waited. He said it. She could tell he'd rehearsed it, which made it land harder, not softer. You were perfect for the man I was. You don't belong beside the man I became. The room held those words. Simone picked up the fallen gift box from the floor. She didn't know why. Some reflex toward dignity, maybe. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a second. 3 weeks of searching, a jeweler in Itaewon she'd visited 4 times, an engraving she'd changed twice because she wanted it to be exactly right. And then she set it on the end table beside the door. Is Yuna the right kind of woman? She asked, the slightest tightening around his mouth. That's not your concern. Younger, Simone said. Korean, beautiful in the way that reads well at your kind of events. No opinions that complicated your trajectory. Is that the shape of it? Jaemin said nothing. I built your trajectory, Jaemin. Her voice was quiet now. Not broken. Quiet in a different register entirely. I was there when you had 4 men in a shipping container and a plan that 3 separate people told you was going to get you killed. I was there when Kim Dae-ho came at you and you had nothing. Nothing except what I pulled together. I mortgaged property I'd inherited from my mother to keep your operation liquid for 6 months while you restructured. You know I did that. You've never once... I know what you did. Then say it like it means something. He held her gaze. His voice didn't change. You'll be taken care of financially. The agreement is fair. She laughed. It was short, humorless, and came out of her before she could decide whether to let it. Right, she said. Right. She picked up her coat from the chair. She had left it there on her way in, already planning to stay, already imagining them opening a bottle of something and sitting close together the way they hadn't sat in longer than she could clearly remember. She put the coat on. She picked up her bag. Simone. He said her name when she was almost at the door. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She turned around. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd stopped letting herself look for a while now, because looking too directly at what they'd become felt like touching a nerve. He looked back. He was still the most formidable man she'd ever been in a room with. That wasn't going to change. The specific gravity of him would probably always do something to the air when he walked in. But standing there in the doorway of a house she'd helped build, she felt something she hadn't expected. Beneath the grief and the nausea and the cold-crawling rage was something that felt, she'd only understand this later, working through it in the small hours of too many nights. Almost like clarity. The lock had just opened. She hadn't known she'd been inside one. She walked out without answering him. She walked down the stone path past the lanterns from Kyoto and through the iron gates and out onto the street where the October cold hit her face like a flat hand. And she kept walking because she did not have a destination yet. She only had the absolute animal need to be moving. And she walked 3 blocks before her legs stopped working correctly, and she found herself leaning against a concrete wall in the cold night air of Seoul, with her eyes closed and her briefcase held against her chest like a shield. She did not cry. She was furious that she wanted to. What she did instead, after 4 minutes against that wall, was take out her phone and call Betrayal Carter. It rang twice. Hey you, how was the... Betrayal stopped. Simone, talk to me. I need a place tonight. A pause. Just a second. I'll leave the key under the pot. You want me to be awake when you get here? No, Simone said. Then, yes. Okay. No questions, no performance, just, I'll put the kettle on. Simone exhaled. The cold air went deep into her lungs, and for a moment she just stood on the street in Seoul, with her husband's words still sitting in her chest like something lodged wrong, something that would need to be removed carefully. And she thought about the mortgage on her mother's property and the 6 months she'd spent holding Jaemin's empire together with financial instruments and sheer force of will while he built what he built. And she thought about the word papers and the word months and the word prepared. He had been planning. While she was attending his dinners, defending his name, and choosing furniture for his sitting room, he had been building an exit from her. She pushed herself off the wall. She flagged down a cab. She sat in the back seat and watched Seoul move past the window, all lit storefronts and traffic and ordinary life continuing regardless. And she felt the grief and the rage settle into something denser and more deliberate at the base of her spine, something that wasn't done becoming yet. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew, with a precision that surprised her, that she was not going to sign anything until she understood exactly what those papers contained. And that understanding, it turned out, was going to be more devastating than the night she'd just survived. Betrayal Carter lived in a 4th-floor apartment in Mapo-gu that smelled like coffee grounds and the particular kind of organized chaos that belonged to a woman who read 3 books simultaneously and never quite finished unpacking from a move she'd made 4 years ago. There were stacks of legal journals on the kitchen counter and a half-finished canvas propped against the living room wall, and exactly 1 photograph hung straight. Everything else lean, tilted, settled at angles that somehow added up to a home. Simone had always loved it here. She stood in the doorway at 11:40 at night with her coat still on and her bag against her hip, and Betrayal took 1 look at her face and didn't say a single unnecessary word, just stepped back, let her in, closed the door. The kettle was already going. Simone sat at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface, palms down, the way she'd learned to do in high-pressure meetings when she needed to keep herself from showing anything. Old habit. The wood was cool under her fingers. Betrayal set a mug in front of her, sat down across from her. She was 43, a Black American woman who had come to Seoul on a corporate law fellowship 11 years ago and simply never left. And she had the particular watchfulness of someone who had spent years reading rooms full of people who underestimated her. She and Simone had found each other at an expat networking event 7 years ago and had been, since approximately the fourth hour of that first conversation, something closer to sisters than friends. She looked at Simone now and waited. 3 years, Simone said. Brielle's expression didn't crack, but her jaw tightened. Yuna. It wasn't a question. He told me himself. Simone picked up the mug, put it down without drinking. He had divorce papers prepared, he said months ago. He said his attorney would contact mine next week. He had it all. He had it scheduled, Brie. Like a meeting. Like something you put on a calendar. Did you look at the papers? I didn't go to the study. Brielle was quiet for a moment. Then, you need to see them before anything else happens. Before you talk to him again. Before you sign a single thing or respond to any communication from his attorney. You understand that? I know. Do you? Because right now you look like a woman who just had the floor taken out from under her, and those are exactly the moments when people agree to things they spend the next 10 years trying to undo. Simone looked at her. I'm not going to sign anything. Okay. I mean it. I know you mean it. I also know you loved him, and loving someone that much after that long creates a very specific kind of... It creates a pull, Simone. Even when they've done the worst thing, especially then. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the city, 12 floors below, and the refrigerator's low hum. Simone stared at the table. He said I was perfect for the man he was. Her voice was flat. She was working to keep it that way. He said I didn't belong beside the man he became. Brielle was still. He said that. Word for word. Something moved across Brielle's face. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled than anger and therefore more dangerous. She stood up. She went to the counter and stood there with her back to Simone for a moment, and Simone could see the tension in her shoulders, the deliberate quality of the breath she took. I need you to listen to me, Brielle said, turning around. I need you to hear what I'm about to say and not react to it emotionally, because I'm going to say it because I love you, and because I have been watching this for longer than you realize. Simone looked at her. The J-Man who built his organization, the one you helped build, that man had specific rules about asset management, very specific. He never kept anything he didn't need to keep trackable in his own name. You knew that. You knew that was how he operated. Yes. When did that change? Simone opened her mouth, closed it. Think about it, Brielle said. When did you last have full visibility into the financial architecture of your shared holdings? Not the legitimate business front stuff. The real picture. The silence stretched. 2 years, Simone said slowly. Maybe 2.5. He restructured the overseas accounts and said it was for tax optimization, and She stopped. I didn't push. You didn't push, Brielle repeated, not with accusation, just wait. Simone sat with that. She felt something shifting beneath the grief now, something colder. You think he started moving things? I think a man who had divorce papers prepared months ago didn't just decide to prepare divorce papers months ago. I think this has been in motion longer than that. And I think, Brielle said carefully, that you need to talk to Victoria Monroe. Simone had heard the name. International litigation, primarily asset recovery and high-conflict divorce proceedings involving ultra-high net worth individuals. A reputation that preceded her through 3 continents. She works mafia cases? She works cases involving powerful men who believe their power makes them untouchable. That's her whole specialty. Brielle sat back down. I can get you a meeting this week. Simone nodded once. It was a small motion, but it cost her something. The last thread of a hope she hadn't consciously acknowledged she was still holding. Some part of her had been waiting, even in the cab, even walking up Brielle's stairs, for a reality in which this had a simpler explanation. A crisis. A mistake. A door she could still close. Brielle reached across the table and put her hand over Simone's. They sat like that for a while. Neither of them said anything more that night. Victoria Monroe's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam that had the particular kind of corporate restraint that communicated expense more effectively than ostentation would have. Clean lines, neutral tones, art that was interesting without being aggressive. Simone arrived 8 minutes early, which was her habit, and spent those 8 minutes in the waiting area with her spine straight and her hands folded and her face showing nothing. Victoria came out herself to collect her, which was notable. She was Korean-British, somewhere in her early 50s, with the compact efficiency of a woman who had learned decades ago that the fastest way to get somewhere was to move without announcing the movement. She shook Simone's hand with a grip that meant something, made eye contact that was direct without being theatrical, and led her into a conference room where 3 thick folders already sat on the table. "I pulled what I could from public records in 48 hours, Victoria said, settling into the chair across from Simone. "Before we discuss those, I want to hear it from you. All of it, from the beginning." So Simone told her. She started with the beginning, not the anniversary night, but the actual beginning. Jamin at 32 with 4 men and a plan, and the particular ferocity of someone who'd decided the world owed him a reckoning and intended to collect. She told Victoria about the early years, the properties she'd mortgaged, the 6 months she'd spent managing cash flow for an operation that was being restructured under pressure, while simultaneously maintaining the legitimate business front that kept everything from collapsing into legal exposure. She told her about the strategies she'd developed, and the partnerships she'd brokered, and the specific moment, 4 years in, when she'd understood that the Hanul syndicate was not going to fail. Not because Jamin was as formidable as he believed himself to be, but because she had built the infrastructure around his formidability that made it sustainable. Victoria listened without interrupting. She had a pen she turned slowly between her fingers, end over end, and her eyes were steady and focused in the way of someone taking in not just the words but the texture of the speaker. When Simone finished, Victoria opened the first folder. "The Hanul Group's legitimate holdings as of 3 years ago," she said. "This is what was publicly registered." She turned it to face Simone. "This is the current picture." The difference was not subtle. Simone stared at the comparative columns for a long moment. The properties were different, not reduced, repositioned, names she didn't recognize on the registration documents, shell entities she'd never been made aware of, a Cayman structure that appeared to have been established. She checked the date twice, 4 years ago. Her chest went tight. 4 years, she said. "The earliest transfer we can trace," Victoria confirmed, "which means this predates the restructuring he told you was for tax purposes. Significantly." The room felt smaller suddenly. Simone put both hands flat on the table, that old reflex, and breathed through the calculation her mind was making involuntarily, working backward through every conversation and decision and moment of deliberately not asking too many questions, mapping them against this timeline the way you map a wound against the shape of the blade that made it. "He started moving assets before the affair," she said, "or concurrent with it beginning." Victoria's voice was measured, precise, carrying no performance of emotion. "It's difficult to establish which initiated which. What's clear is that the financial separation and the personal one are not independent events." "How much?" Victoria turned to the second folder. "Conservatively? Based on what we can trace so far? The gap between what you'd be entitled to under a fair assessment of marital assets and what his current agreement likely offers is somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 million. Simone heard the number. She sat with it. From outside, 14 floors down, she could hear the city. "The agreement he prepared," she said. "If I had to guess its structure without seeing it, and I don't have to guess, I've seen this precise architecture before, it will appear fair on its face. It will reference a subset of assets that are legitimate and visible and will offer you a portion of those that seems reasonable without ever acknowledging the transferred wealth, because the transferred wealth doesn't exist on paper. It will be designed to be signed by a woman who is grieving and trusts that her husband is at least honoring his word about treating her fairly, even while ending the marriage." Victoria paused. "He underestimated you." "He didn't think I'd look," Simone said. "He thought the emotional shock would be sufficient." Victoria closed the folder. "Was it?" Simone looked at her steadily. "What does the process look like?" "Long, expensive, difficult. He will use every resource at his disposal to obstruct, delay, and discredit. His attorneys are among the best in Asia. His connections in the judiciary are," she paused carefully, "worth accounting for." Another pause. "And he is not a man who loses without escalating." "I know what kind of man he is." "Then you know this won't stay in a courtroom." Simone held her gaze. "What do you need from me?" Victoria looked at her for a moment, then she opened the third folder. "Everything you remember." Every partnership you brokered, every decision you were central to, every person whose trust was secured through your work rather than his. Documentation where it exists. Your testimony where it doesn't. She spread several pages across the table. The case for your contribution to the Hanul Syndicate's success is substantial. We build that case first. Everything else follows from that foundation. Simone leaned forward and looked at the pages. She thought about the property she'd mortgaged, her mother's property. The one her mother had worked 30 years to own free and clear, and had left to Simone with the specific, weighted meaning of a black woman who understood what it meant for her daughter to have something that was hers that no one could take. She had mortgaged it to keep Jamin's empire liquid during a restructuring he'd told her was temporary, and she had paid it off herself over 3 years, never asking him to cover it, absorbing it as her own cost because she had believed, with everything she was, that what they were building together belonged to both of them equally. She picked up the pen Victoria slid across the table. "Where do we start?" she said. The days that followed had the particular quality of a life being taken apart and rebuilt at the same time. Simone moved through them on very little sleep and the specific kind of focus that exists on the other side of emotional collapse, the place where you stop feeling the weight of something and start moving it. She met with Victoria every other day. She compiled documentation from her own records, files she'd kept methodically over years because she was the kind of woman who understood that information was its own form of security. She made calls to former business partners, many of whom she had not spoken to in some time, and she was careful about how she framed the conversations, careful to listen for the texture of the response as much as the content. What she heard surprised her even as it confirmed everything. 2 of the men she reached out to, a logistics director named Park Sung-jin, who'd been with the Hanul organization in its early years, and a financial consultant named Lee Jun-ho, who had helped structure their first international partnerships, each said, in their own way and with their own specific hesitation, that they had been wondering when she'd call. Park said, "I always thought it was strange, the way his version of the company's history left you out of it. In the early days, everyone who was there knew who was keeping things together." Lee said more carefully, "There were decisions made in the last few years that I wasn't comfortable with. If I were asked to speak to what I know about the organization's actual history, about who contributed what, I would have something to say." Simone wrote everything down. She reported it to Victoria, who began the careful work of establishing who might testify and to what. The day the papers arrived from Jae-min's attorney, delivered by courier at 9 in the morning to Brielle's apartment, where Simone was still staying, she sat with them at the kitchen table for 2 hours before she opened them. Brielle sat across from her, drinking coffee, not rushing her. When Simone finally read them, it took her 20 minutes. She read each page twice. She set the last page down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, and then she said quietly, "42 million in declared joint assets, 50% offered." Brielle's eyes sharpened. "Based on what Victoria's traced already," Simone said, "the actual figure is closer to 140 million. Minimum." Brielle set her coffee down. "He's offering you 21 million on a pie worth 140. At minimum." The kitchen was very quiet. "Send it to Victoria," Brielle said. "It's already photographed." Simone gathered the pages. "He's going to know I didn't sign. His attorney will call by end of week." "Good. Let them call." Simone looked at her. "This is going to get ugly." "It was already ugly," Brielle said. "You just didn't know it yet." The call came on Thursday, not from the attorney, from Jae-min. His number appeared on her screen at 7:45 in the evening, and she stared at it for 3 full rings before she answered. She was standing in Brielle's spare room, which she had by now half organized into something functional. Laptop on the desk, files stacked with precision, a notepad with 3 columns of notes that she kept adding to. She answered on the 4th ring. "Simone." His voice was the same. That was the thing about Jae-min. Nothing about his voice ever changed based on what was happening. It was always even, always carrying the same specific weight. She had once found that quality stabilizing. "The papers haven't come back." "No," she said. "My attorney expected them by Wednesday." "Your attorney can continue to wait." A pause. Brief. Controlled. You're talking to someone. I'm going to need you to have all further communication directed through legal counsel, she said. She had practiced the sentence. She said it clean. Another pause, longer this time. Simone. His voice shifted a fraction, not into softness exactly, but into the register he used when he was recalculating. She knew every register. I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, she said. And it was almost true. What she was, at this particular moment, was colder and more deliberate than she had been at any point in the past 10 days, and she understood with a clarity that felt physical, felt like her own skeleton solidifying, that she had been the wrong person to try to move quietly out of the way. I'm informed. There's a difference. The silence on his end had a different texture now. My attorney, she repeated. All communication through counsel. Good night, Jaemin. She ended the call. She stood in Brielle's spare room in the quiet and felt her own heartbeat, fast, but not from fear, and thought about $40 to $60 million relocated through structures built over 4 years while she sat at his table and defended his name and believed they were building something together. And she thought about her mother's property and the weight of that decision and what it had meant to make it, and something inside her, something that had been coming loose since the night on the stone path, finished detaching completely. He called back twice. She didn't answer. She sat down at the desk and opened her laptop and wrote Victoria a 6-paragraph email detailing the call, and at the bottom she wrote, I want to depose Park Sung-jin and Lee Jun-ho as soon as you can arrange it. I also want to know everything about the Cayman structure, every name on every document. We go through all of it. She sent it at 8:17. Victoria's response came at 8:49. I was hoping you'd say that. I'll schedule both depositions for next week. And Simone, there's something in the Cayman records you haven't seen yet. We need to talk tomorrow morning. Simone stared at that last line. There's something in the Cayman records you haven't seen yet. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark of Brielle's spare room and listened to the city outside the window and understood, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 8 years reading the architecture of hidden things, that whatever Victoria had found was not going to be the thing that broke her. It was going to be the thing that changed everything. Victoria Monroe did not do small talk. Simone had understood that from their first meeting, but she understood it more completely when she walked into Victoria's office at 8:53 the following morning and found the attorney already standing at the conference table with 4 folders open and a 5th one, thicker than the others, its edges slightly worn as though it had been handled repeatedly in the past 24 hours, positioned at the center like something that needed to be approached carefully. Victoria looked up when Simone came in. Something in her expression was different from their previous meetings. Not soft. Victoria Monroe's face did not do soft. But there was a quality of preparation there. The way a surgeon looks before delivering a prognosis they've had time to sit with, and the patient hasn't. Sit down, Victoria said. Simone sat. Victoria remained standing. She put her hand on the thick folder at the center of the table, but didn't open it yet. I need to ask you something before we start, and I need you to answer it honestly, regardless of how it reflects on anything you've told me so far. All right? When Jaemin restructured the overseas accounts 2.5 years ago, the one he framed as tax optimization, did you receive any documentation of that restructuring? Any paperwork at all? Anything that came to you directly, with your name on it, in any capacity? Simone thought about it. She was precise by nature, and the question was precise, so she gave it the careful consideration it deserved rather than answering from the top of her memory. He mentioned it twice in conversation, once at home, once at a dinner with the Hanul Group's external accountant. There was nothing sent to me directly. I wasn't included in the actual process. Did you ask to be? A pause. He said it was routine. I had other things I was managing. Did you ask to be included? Victoria repeated. Simone held her gaze. No. Victoria opened the folder. The first page was a corporate registration document. Simone recognized the format. Cayman Islands, standard structure. The particular layout of offshore legal architecture she'd seen enough of in Jaemin's world to read fluently. She scanned it. The company name meant nothing to her. She went to the registered directors section. She found her own name. The air went out of the room. Not Jaemin's name. not the name of any of his lieutenants or the shell entities she'd been learning to trace over the past days. Her name, Simone A. Caldwell. Listed as a director of an offshore holding company established 4 years ago, a company that had been used. She was reading faster now, her eyes moving down the page against her will, her body getting ahead of her mind. To receive transfers from 3 of the Hanuel Syndicate's most profitable international operations before those funds were redistributed into accounts she had no knowledge of and had never accessed. "I didn't," she started. "I know," Victoria said. "I never signed anything. I've never seen this document. I didn't know this company existed." "I know that too." Victoria pulled out the second page. "Your signature appears on the directorship appointment. It's dated 14 months ago." She placed it in front of Simone. "Do you recognize that signature?" Simone looked at it. She recognized it the way you recognize something that has been taken from you and altered. The fundamental shape of it was hers, the particular way she formed the C and the double L at the end of Caldwell. But the pressure was wrong and there was a quality to the ink distribution that was slightly off, and she had stared at her own signature on enough documents over enough years to know what she was looking at. "That's a forgery," she said. "Yes. He forged my signature on directorship papers for an offshore company, and then used that company to—" She stopped. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. "To move money. Approximately $23 million passed through this structure over 18 months, Victoria said. Your name is on the directorship, which means that if this company were ever subject to regulatory or legal scrutiny, I'd be on the hook for it." Simone's voice was very quiet. "That's what this is. He didn't just hide assets, he hid them through me. He built a structure that would implicate me if anyone ever looked." Victoria sat down across from her. "It is, in my professional assessment, the most deliberate piece of financial architecture I have encountered in 22 years of this work. He didn't simply protect himself from you. He built a situation in which pursuing him aggressively would expose you to legal liability. Because the moment you surface this company in litigation, his defense will be that you were a knowing participant, that you signed the documents, that the money moved with your authorization." Simone stared at the signature, her name, on something she'd never touched. "He knew I'd fight," she said. "He planned for you to fight, and he built a mechanism to use your fight against you." Victoria paused. "This is why the divorce agreement was structured to appear fair. He didn't need to be overtly punitive. He needed you to sign quickly and quietly. If you signed, he kept everything and you walked away with $21 million and your name on nothing incriminating. If you fought—" Victoria let the sentence complete itself. Simone sat with it. She thought about the phone call 3 nights ago, his voice, even and recalculating when she'd said, "I'm informed." She had felt, in that moment, like she was holding something, like the knowledge she'd gathered with Victoria had shifted the balance. She understood now that she'd been wrong. He had known she was gathering information. He had probably known before she'd even walked out of his house that night. And what she'd been reading as confidence built from discovery was something he had been prepared for her to find. The Cayman structure was not a secret he'd failed to hide well enough. It was a trap he'd built in the shape of a secret, one that would only spring when she pulled on it. "What are my options?" she said. Her voice came out flat. She was working very hard to keep it that way. Victoria looked at her directly. 3. First, you sign the original agreement, take the $21 million, and walk away with your name clean. Second, you pursue litigation knowing that his defense will deploy the forged directorship, which means you spend significant resources fighting both the asset claim and a potential fraud allegation that could follow you professionally even if you ultimately prevail. Third, she paused. Third is harder and less certain, but it's the only path that addresses the full scope of what he's done. Tell me, will we prove the forgery before he can weaponize it? We establish, through forensic document analysis and independent testimony, that your signature was fabricated. We build that case simultaneously with the asset case. And we find someone inside his organization, someone with direct knowledge of the Cayman structure and who authorized it, who is willing to testify to that. The room was very quiet. "A witness," Simone said. Someone who was involved in setting this up, who processed the paperwork. Who knows whose instruction it came from? Victoria held her gaze. Do you know anyone in his inner circle who might have reason to distance themselves from him at this point? Simone thought about it. She thought about it with the same methodical quality she'd used when she was actually inside that world, mapping relationships, understanding motivations, reading the specific fault lines and loyalty that existed in any organization built on power rather than trust. She thought about Lee Jun-ho, who had said there were decisions he wasn't comfortable with. She thought about the careful way he'd phrased it, and she thought about what a man like that, a financial consultant, professional reputation as his primary asset, would think about his name being connected to a forged directorship appointment. Possibly, she said. Then we move fast. Before he knows what you know. Victoria started gathering the pages. I need to ask you something else. Simone waited. Is there any documentation? Anything at all from the period when you mortgaged your personal property to support the Hanul operation? Bank records, correspondence, anything that establishes the transaction and its purpose? Yes, Simone said. I kept everything. For the first time in the meeting, something shifted in Victoria's expression. Almost imperceptible. Almost, but not quite. Where? A safe deposit box. A bank in Itaewon. I've had it since before we married. He doesn't know it exists. Victoria looked at her for a moment. Get those documents today. Don't wait. Don't go home first. Don't call anyone on your regular phone. Go directly. She slid a business card across the table. This is a secure courier service. Have everything delivered here before 5 o'clock. Simone picked up the card. One more thing, Victoria said. The meeting Jaemin has been requesting. The in-person conversation his assistant has been calling Brielle's number about. Don't refuse it. Simone looked at her. Don't refuse it, Victoria repeated. Accept it. Schedule it. Go. You want me to meet with him? I want you to meet with him wearing this. Victoria opened a drawer and slid a small device across the table. It was smaller than Simone expected, flat, about the size of a thumbnail. South Korean law permits single-party consent recording in most civil contexts. My legal team has reviewed the specific application. Anything he says in that meeting, any admission, any reference to assets, any statement about his intentions, is potentially admissible. Simone looked at the device on the table between them. She thought about the night in the foyer with the anniversary gift and the warm light from under the door, and the particular quality of the silence after Yuna left. She thought about what he'd said. You were perfect for the man I was. She had carried those words for 10 days like something she couldn't put down. She picked up the device. She went to the bank in Itaewon directly from Victoria's office. She took a cab she paid for in cash, and she sat in the back with her bag on her lap, and her hands still, and her mind running the full architecture of what she now understood, fitting it against what she'd believed for 8 years. And the process was something like what she imagined it felt like to have a bone reset. Necessary, violent, the pain of correction rather than injury. The safe deposit box contained what she'd told Victoria it contained. 11 years of documentation, the mortgage papers, the bank correspondence, a letter she'd written to herself during that 6-month period, something she'd done as a private accounting, never intending for anyone to read it, that detailed her decision and her reasoning and her understanding that what she was doing might cost her financially but would, she'd believed, come back to them together in the form of what they built. She sat in the small private room of the bank vault with that letter in her hands and read it. She had been so certain. She sent everything to Victoria's courier before noon. The meeting with Jae-min was arranged for the following Wednesday. His assistant called Brielle's number. Simone still wasn't answering her own phone for his contacts, and communicated that Jae-min would prefer a neutral location, a private dining room at a hotel in Yongsan. Simone relayed through Brielle that she agreed. She spent the 5 days between learning to wear the device without thinking about it. Victoria had a colleague who worked with her on it, a dry, efficient woman named Seo-ji who treated the whole process with the matter-of-fact professionalism of someone fitting a client for specialized equipment, which was essentially what she was doing. By Tuesday night, Simone could place it and forget it was there. She did not sleep well that week. She lay in the narrow bed in Brielle's spare room and stared at the ceiling and thought about Lee Jun-ho, who had agreed to speak with Victoria's team and who had, in that initial conversation which Victoria relayed to Simone in careful summary, confirmed that he had been present for conversations about the Cayman Structures establishment and that the directorship appointment papers had been processed through a notary he could name. He had not yet committed to formal testimony. He was, in Victoria's phrase, still calculating his risk. Simone understood that calculation intimately. She had made it herself, in different forms, 100 times in 8 years. The question of what you were willing to stand behind when standing behind it cost something real. On Tuesday night, the night before the meeting, Brielle came into the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there. "You can still not go," she said finally. "I know. Victoria has enough to build the case without the recording." "Does she?" Brielle looked at her hands. "Probably not the strongest version of it." "No." "Simone." Brielle's voice was careful. "He is not a man who responds well to feeling cornered. If he figures out what you're doing in that room, he won't. If he does," Simone looked at the ceiling, "then I'll deal with it." "That's not a plan." "No," she agreed. "It's a decision." Brielle sat with that. Outside, the city made its constant noise. "I'll be in the hotel lobby," she said finally. "The whole time. I'm not negotiating that." Simone looked at her. Something moved in her chest. Not grief, not fear. Something closer to the specific weight of knowing you are not alone in the place you thought was most solitary. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Brielle stood. "Get some sleep." She didn't sleep. At 2 a.m, she lay in the dark and thought about $23 million moving through a structure built in her name without her knowledge, her forged signature on papers she'd never held, the entire architecture of it designed to make her complicity look real if she ever tried to surface it. She thought about what kind of mind builds that, what kind of planning, what kind of specific sustained contempt for the person you're building it around. She thought about the letter she'd written to herself in the bank vault 11 years ago. She thought about her mother's property. At 3:15, she sat up in the dark, and she was not going to cry. She had decided that, and she didn't. What she did was reach for the notepad on the nightstand, and in the dark she wrote a single line that she could barely read in the morning. "He built a trap inside the life I thought we were building together." She looked at it in the gray morning light. Then she got up, showered, dressed in the charcoal suit she'd had cleaned and pressed, and fixed her face in Brielle's bathroom mirror with the same precision she'd always brought to preparing for high-stakes meetings. Because that was what this was, she told herself. That was the only frame that was going to get her through the next several hours without falling apart. A high-stakes meeting. One she intended to win. The hotel was in Yongsan, discreet, the kind of establishment that rented private dining rooms for exactly this kind of conversation. Jaemin was already there when she arrived, which was characteristic. He always positioned himself in rooms before other people entered them, another tool in the arsenal of presence. He was sitting at the table with a glass of water and no food ordered, and he was wearing the dark charcoal suit that she had always privately thought was his best, which may or may not have been intentional. He looked at her when she came in. She held his gaze as she sat down. The device was in place. Victoria's colleague had checked it 40 minutes ago. Brielle was downstairs with a coffee and her phone. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You wanted to talk," she said. "I'm here." Something moved in his expression. Recalibration. She could read his micro-expressions with a fluency born of 8 years of close proximity, and she could see that she was not presenting the way he expected. He'd been prepared, she thought, for some version of her fragility, or at minimum, her uncertainty. What he was seeing instead was a woman sitting very still, with her hands folded on the table, and her face showing him precisely nothing. "The agreement," he started. "I have questions about the agreement," she said. "Of course, my attorney can address. I'd rather address them with you." She kept her voice even, conversational almost. "You're a direct person. I've always appreciated that about you. I thought a direct conversation would be more efficient." He studied her for a moment. "What questions?" The asset valuation, the declared total. She watched his face. I want to understand how it was arrived at. Something shifted in the set of his jaw, barely perceptible. My financial team conducted a full assessment. Your financial team. She let that sit for exactly one beat. Not a joint assessment, not an independent valuation. The assets are, Jamin. She said his name the way he used to say hers in negotiations. Quiet, precise, a signal that the performance portion of the conversation was finished. I've been going through records, our records, the history of what we built and how it was built and where it went. I've been doing that carefully. The water glass was on the table between them, and he was not touching it. His hands were flat on the table. She recognized the posture. She'd used it herself. What records? He said. The Cayman structure, for example. She watched the word land. The one established 4 years ago. The one with my name on the directorship. The room was very quiet. Jamin looked at her. His face didn't break. It was one of the things she had always recognized about him. The absolute governance of his expression under pressure, the way he could absorb a hit and give you nothing in the half-second after. But she was watching for something specific, and she found it, the briefest, most minute tightening around his eyes. Not guilt, not surprise, recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood that the conversation he prepared for is not the conversation he's having. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. And Simone looked at him across the table, at the man she had mortgaged her mother's property for, the man she had stood beside in rooms full of dangerous people and defended and protected and believed in with a comprehensiveness that had required her, she understood now, to stop paying attention to herself. And she felt something happen inside her that was not rage and not grief, and not the cold, deliberate planning energy she'd been running on for 10 days. It was simpler than all of those things. It was the specific, irreversible moment when you stop hoping someone will choose to be who you needed them to be, and you understand instead exactly who they are and have always been, and you realize the only question left is who you are going to be in response. I think you do, she said, and she reached into her bag and set a single page on the table between them, a copy, not the original, Victoria had been clear about that, and she watched Jamin look at his own corporate architecture reflected back at him with her name on it, and she watched him understand in real time that she had found the trap he built inside the life they were supposed to be building together. His jaw tightened once. Where did you get this? He said. His voice had changed register. Barely, but enough. Does it matter? Simone. And now there was something in his voice she had almost never heard there. A quality that was not quite warning and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. You don't understand the full picture of what— I understand enough, she said. I understand that my name is on documents I never signed. I understand that money moved through a structure I never knew existed. I understand— She leaned forward slightly, just slightly, enough to cross the distance of the table without standing, that you built something designed to look like my participation in case I ever tried to hold you accountable. Jamin was very still. So here is what is going to happen, she said. You're going to hear from my attorney by end of week, and the conversation we have from this point forward is going to be very different from the one you prepared for. She picked up her bag. She stood. You built your whole exit on the assumption that I would be too broken to look carefully, she said. That was your mistake. I built half of what you have. I know how you think. I know how you hide things. She looked at him one final time, the full, direct look she'd stopped letting herself give him for too long. You should have remembered that before you put my name on something you built to bury me. She walked out. She walked down the corridor and into the elevator, and her hands were not shaking and her breathing was controlled, and it was not until the elevator doors closed and she was alone in the mirrored box descending toward the lobby that she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 4 seconds and felt the full weight of what she'd just done move through her like a current. She had just told the most dangerous man in Seoul that she knew what he'd built. She had done it on purpose. And the recording device in her jacket had captured every word he'd said in response, including the 3 words that were going to matter most when Victoria played them for the first time, The three words Jae-min had said without thinking in the moment his composure slipped just far enough. The words that were not a denial and not an explanation, but something that functioned, in a court of law, as something far more useful than either. Where did you get this? Not, what are you talking about? Not, I don't know what that is. Where did you get this? The involuntary acknowledgement of a man who had just recognized his own blueprint in someone else's hands, and in recognizing it had confirmed, without intending to, that it existed, that he knew it, and that he had reason to want to know how far it had traveled. The elevator doors opened. Brielle was standing in the lobby. She looked at Simone's face and asked no questions. She simply fell into step beside her, and they walked together through the hotel doors and out into the October air of Seoul, and Simone breathed in the cold and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not relief, not victory, something more complicated and more durable than either. She had gone into that room as the woman he expected. She had come out as something he had never planned for. But what she didn't know yet, what Victoria would tell her 40 minutes later in a phone call that would make Simone stop walking mid-stride on a busy Yongsan street, was that Lee Jun-ho had called that morning while she was in the meeting, and what he'd said had changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about the last 4 years of her marriage. Simone stopped walking on a crowded Yongsan sidewalk at 11:47 in the morning, and the city kept moving around her like water around a stone. Victoria's voice on the phone was controlled. It was always controlled. But there was something underneath the control today that Simone had not heard in their previous conversations. A quality of contained urgency, like pressure behind glass. Lee Jun-ho called this morning at 9:15, Victoria said. Before your meeting, I didn't want to contact you while you were in the room. Tell me. He's willing to testify, formally, full deposition. Brielle was standing 2 steps away, watching Simone's face, reading it the way she always did. Not intrusively, just present, a specific kind of attention that asked nothing and offered everything. What changed? Simone said. He received a visit yesterday evening. 2 men, associates of Jae-min's organization. They didn't threaten him explicitly. They were too careful for that. But the message was clear enough. He was being reminded that his involvement in certain financial decisions over the years created exposure for him, and that his best protection was continued cooperation with the Hanul Group's interests. Simone processed that. He intimidated his own witness. He tried to consolidate one. He didn't know Lee had already spoken to us, and the visit had the opposite effect of what he intended. A brief pause. Lee is angry. Frightened, yes, but the anger is stronger. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he spent 4 years telling himself the financial structures were legally ambiguous enough that he wasn't complicit in anything that would follow him. Yesterday's visit made him understand that Jae-min considers him complicit regardless. So he has nothing left to protect by staying quiet. What does he know? Everything about the Cayman structure, the notary who processed the forged directorship appointment, the name of the Hanul Group attorney who drafted the original documents. Another pause, heavier than the first. And Simone? He knows when it was established. You told me 4 years ago. The structure, yes, but the decision, the initial conversation in which Jae-min instructed his inner circle to begin the financial separation and the directorship setup, Lee dates that to 5 years and 4 months ago. Simone stood on the sidewalk and felt the cold air on her face and did the arithmetic she did not want to do. 5 years and 4 months ago, she and Jae-min had been in their 3rd year of marriage. She had still been fully embedded in the Hanul Group's operations. She had been, at that specific point in time, in the middle of negotiating the partnership that opened their first legitimate international trade channel. The deal that had, more than any other single event, given the Hanul syndicate its public-facing credibility. He had begun building his exit from her while she was building his most important bridge. Simone. Victoria's voice was careful. Are you still there? Yes. Her voice came out steady. She was distantly impressed by that. What do we do with this? Lee will give us a formal deposition next week. I want him in front of my team before Heyman's attorneys have any opportunity to reach him again. I'm also filing an emergency motion to compel disclosure of the offshore entities. The forged directorship gives us grounds, and I want those grounds established in the court record before he can move to restructure or dissolve anything." The pace of Victoria's words had shifted. She was in motion now, and Simone could hear it. "But I need you to understand what this means for the next several weeks. He's going to come at this hard. He has resources and connections and a significant motivation to suppress the Cayman information before it reaches a judge." "I understand." "And Simone, the recording from this morning, I need it today. Brielle is driving me to your office now." She ended the call. Brielle was already moving toward the car. They didn't speak much on the drive. Brielle took a route that avoided the main corridors she usually used, a habit from years of navigating Seoul traffic, or something more instinctive than that. Simone wasn't sure. The city slid past the windows in its ordinary Thursday morning mode, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in it a man was receiving information about how his morning had just gone and was beginning to calculate his response. Simone sat in the passenger seat and felt the recording device still in her jacket pocket, and thought about 5 years and 4 months, and the trade channel negotiation, and the specific trip to Singapore she'd made alone. Jaemin had sent her alone because he was managing something else and trusted her to close it, had said so, had said, "I trust you to close this more than I trust myself." And she thought about coming home from that trip and the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table and said that what she'd done in Singapore had changed the organization's future, had set it with a particular quality of admiration that she had held on to for years as evidence of what they were to each other. He had already been planning to remove her. She had come home from Singapore carrying what she thought was proof of their partnership, and he had sat across from her knowing he had already begun dismantling it. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth for a moment. Then she put her hand back in her lap and looked at the road. Victoria had the audio within the hour. She and Seo Ji-ai listened to it together in the conference room, while Simone sat at the table and drank the coffee Brielle had put in front of her without tasting it. When "Where did you get this?" came through the small speaker, Victoria stopped the playback and looked at Simone. "That's enough," she said. "Is it admissible?" "I'll have my litigation team review it today. Based on the consent statute and the specific context, a private meeting, initiated at his request, in a jurisdiction where single-party consent applies. I believe it is." She set the recorder on the table. "It's not a confession, but combined with Lee's testimony and the forensic document analysis on the forged signature, it is consistent with the pattern of a man who knows exactly what the Cayman structure is and is alarmed to discover someone else does too." "When do we file?" "Monday. I want the weekend to finalize the forensic report and get Lee's preliminary statement in writing." Victoria looked at her steadily. "Between now and Monday, you should expect contact, pressure. Not necessarily from him directly." The pressure came on Friday. It came in the form of a woman named Han Mi Rai, who called Brielle's number at 10 in the morning and identified herself as a mutual acquaintance. A woman Simone had met twice at Hanoil Group social events, charming and connected and clearly operating now as a messenger. The message, delivered in the pleasant tones of a woman who had practiced obscuring steel in silk, was that Jae-min was prepared to revise the financial agreement substantially, and that he hoped Simone would consider the revision before Monday. "How substantially?" Brielle said flatly. Because Simone had gestured for her to handle it. A pause. "Significantly more favorable. Have his attorney contact our attorney," Brielle said, and ended the call. Simone was sitting across the kitchen table watching her. "He knows we're filing Monday." "He knows something's coming Monday," Brielle said. "He doesn't know what exactly. He's trying to buy the weekend." "Don't respond." "Already didn't." The second contact came Saturday evening. This one was less oblique. Jae-min's senior attorney, a man named Choi Byung-wook, who had a reputation for the kind of meticulous legal aggression that kept you technically within bounds while extracting maximum damage, sent a formal letter to Victoria's office that arrived by courier at 6:15. Simone was there when Victoria called to read the key section. "He's threatening a counterfiling," Victoria said, "alleging that you were a knowing participant in the Hanoil Group's financial structuring, using your directorship of the Cayman entity as the basis. He is threatening to file this simultaneously with any motion we bring Monday, and to pursue it as a separate civil action that would potentially implicate you in the movement of those funds. A pause. It's a bluff designed to make us hesitate. If we hesitate past Monday, he gains time to restructure the Cayman entity and complicate our ability to trace the assets. He's betting we'll blink, Simone said. Yes. We don't blink. Victoria was quiet for a moment. The counter-filing threat is not without teeth, Simone. Even as a bluff, it generates legal exposure for you that would need to be defended, costs money and time, and creates a public record of the allegation regardless of whether it ever goes anywhere substantive. He knows that. And if we pull back Monday, he dissolves the structure over the weekend and we lose the cleanest evidence we have. Yes. Simone sat with it. She sat with it for exactly the length of time it took her to understand that there was no version of this that didn't cost her something, and that the question was only what she was willing to pay and what she refused to. File Monday, she said. Full motion, Lee's preliminary statement attached, forensic signature analysis attached, audio documentation referenced. Victoria said, understood. Monday arrived like a fist. Victoria's team filed at 9 in the morning. By 10:15, Jaemin's attorneys had responded with the counter-allegation. By noon, 3 Korean financial news outlets had picked up that a significant legal dispute involving the Hanyul Group's leadership was moving through the courts. By 2 o'clock, 2 of Jaemin's most prominent legitimate business partners had sent inquiries to the Hanyul Group's public relations office asking for clarification about the company's financial governance. The thing about a man who has built his power on the perception of absolute control is that the perception is load-bearing. Crack it, and the whole structure shudders. Simone knew this. She had watched Jaemin manage the perception for years, had in fact been one of the primary architects of it, and she understood with a precision no one else in this fight could match exactly how much weight those cracks could bear before they became fractures. She was at Victoria's office when the call came in. Lee Jun-ho, calling Victoria's direct line at 2:47 in the afternoon. Victoria put it on speaker. Her face was carefully neutral. They contacted me again, Lee said. His voice was thin, stretched, the sound of a man who had not slept. This morning, not men at my door this time, a call. The man on the phone knew my daughter's school schedule. The room went very still. Victoria said, controlled, Lee, are you in a safe location right now? I'm at my office. A breath, ragged, real. They knew her schedule, Victoria. Her Tuesday piano lesson. What time she gets out on Thursdays. Simone was very still. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. I'm going to give you a number to call right now, Victoria said. A private security firm my office works with. You call them before you leave your building today. Do you understand? You call them first. I can't. If I testify now, if this goes public that I... Lee! Victoria's voice sharpened, not unkindly but with an edge that cut through the panic. Listen to me. If you pull back now, you have no protection. They have already shown you they know your family's movements. The only thing that changes your calculation is going forward, making this public, making you a named witness in a formal legal proceeding. Because the moment you are that, harming you or your family becomes dramatically more costly for them than whatever they're trying to suppress. Silence on the line. Lee, Victoria said again, I need... Another breath. I need until tomorrow morning. I can give you until 8 a.m. Victoria looked at Simone while she said it, a direct look that communicated exactly how much margin they had. 8 a.m., Lee. Call me. She ended the call. Simone stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city and breathed through the cold, specific rage that was moving through her chest. Not at Lee Jun-ho, who was a frightened man with a daughter whose school schedule a dangerous organization now demonstrably knew, but at the fact that this was the tool being used. That Jaemin, the man she had slept beside and defended and built alongside, was using a child's schedule as a weapon in a legal dispute about money. He's escalating, she said. Yes. Which means the filing is working. Yes, Victoria said again. And it means we need Lee's formal deposition on record before he can escalate further. If Lee walks back tomorrow. He won't, Simone said. She said it with a certainty she hadn't fully examined yet, and Victoria looked at her, and Simone turned from the window and picked up her bag. "I'm going to talk to him," she said. "Simone, that's not as a witness, as a person." She met Victoria's eyes. "He's making a calculation about whether going forward is survivable. I need him to understand something about that calculation that an attorney can't tell him." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "Don't make him any promises I can't back up." "I won't." She met Lee Junho at his office at 4:30. He was a slight man, mid-50s, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying the wrong thing for too long and could feel the weight of it in his actual body. He sat across from her at his desk with his hands folded and his eyes showing her the full account of what a bad night and a worse morning looked like. She didn't sit down. She stood across from him and she said without preamble, "I know what they said to you, and I know you're afraid for your daughter. I would be too. I am not going to tell you that's irrational or that you should override it." He looked at her. "What I'm going to tell you," she said, "is that I had a mother. She left me a property, a concrete, physical thing that was hers, and that she gave to me because she understood what it meant for a woman to have something no one could take." She kept her voice level. "I used that property to keep Jaemin's organization alive during a 6-month restructuring that would have destroyed everything he'd built. I did it because I believed in what we were building together. And while I was doing that, while I was using my mother's property to protect his empire, he was already in the process of building a financial structure with my name on it, designed to make me look complicit if I ever tried to hold him accountable." Lee's jaw tightened. "He does not stop," she said. "That's what I need you to understand. What happened to you yesterday, the call today, this is not the ceiling of what he's willing to do. It's the floor. He will keep going until you have nothing left to protect, or until the cost of going after you becomes higher than what he's trying to suppress." She leaned forward, both hands on the edge of his desk. "The only way the cost becomes higher is if your testimony is already on record, already public, already a thing that harming you would draw attention to rather than eliminate." Lee looked at his hands. "I know," she said more quietly, "that I'm asking you to be brave on behalf of a fight that isn't yours. I know that. I'm not pretending otherwise." She straightened. "But you were in that room when they built what they built with my name. You know what it is, and you have a daughter whose school schedule they just used to try to scare you into silence, and the only question is whether you let that work." The office was very quiet. Lee Junho looked at her for a long time. Then he reached for his phone and called his personal attorney. The formal deposition was scheduled for Wednesday morning. Simone walked out of his building into the early evening cold of Seoul and stood on the pavement and exhaled, and the breath came out visible in the November air, and she stood there for a moment, just letting the city be loud around her. Her own phone buzzed in her bag. Not Victoria, not Brielle. A number she recognized with the specific, visceral recognition of something written into the body, rather than just the memory. She stared at it for 2 full rings. She answered. "You went to see Lee," Jaemin's voice, controlled as always, but something underneath it that she had only heard twice in 8 years. A quality that was not quite what she'd call fear, because Jaemin did not do fear in any recognizable form, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man who has just understood that the terrain has shifted in a way he didn't authorize. "I did," she said. "Simone." He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard since the early years, since the period before power had made him something that needed managing rather than knowing. "What do you think you're doing?" "I think you know what I'm doing." "You're going to destroy something that you built." She kept her voice even. She was standing on a public pavement in Seoul, and she was having this conversation, and her hands were not shaking, and she wanted to note that somewhere, as evidence of something she'd become in the past 3 weeks that she hadn't been before. "What exactly am I destroying, Jaemin? The structure you built with my forged name on it, the assets you moved while I was negotiating your Singapore deal, the 20 years of—" She stopped. "You don't get to tell me what I'm destroying. You decided what got destroyed when you decided I was the right person to frame." A silence on his end, long enough that she almost thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The control was still there, but the texture beneath it was different, raw, less managed. I never intended for it to go this far. Which part? Any of it. She almost laughed. The impulse came and went. That's not true, she said. You intended every part of it. That's the only thing I know for certain about the last 5 years, how much you intended. Simone, have your attorney call Victoria, she said. That's the only conversation I'm having now. She ended the call. She stood on the pavement. A bus went past. 2 women walked by speaking quickly to each other, shopping bags in hand. An ordinary Tuesday evening in the city, going about its business without reference to any of this. She put her phone in her bag and started walking. Wednesday arrived and Lee Jun-ho arrived with it, at Victoria's office at 8:15, 15 minutes early, with his personal attorney and a manila folder of documents he'd located himself over the past 48 hours. Internal emails, wire transfer confirmations, a notary receipt with a date and an address that would allow them to locate the specific individual who had witnessed a signature that was not Simone's on papers that bore her name. He sat in the conference room across from Victoria's litigation team, and he talked for 4 hours. Simone was not in the room for the deposition. Victoria had recommended against it, and she agreed. She sat in a smaller office down the hall with Betrayal and worked through a different set of documents. The financial records from her own history with the organization, the mortgage papers, the correspondence, the letter she'd written to herself in the vault, building the parallel case for her contribution, while Lee Jun-ho dismantled the fiction of her complicity in the room down the hall. At one point, Betrayal looked up from the documents she was organizing and said, without particular inflection, "You know this is going to be in the news." "I know." The Hanul Group's finances, the offshore structure, his name attached to a forgery allegation. Betrayal set the papers down. People he's done business with for 20 years are going to have to make public decisions about whether they stand with him. Yes. Some of them will. Some of them will, Simone agreed. You're ready for that. Simone looked at the mortgage papers in front of her. Her mother's signature on the original deed, faded but legible, the specific shape of a woman's handwriting that she'd known her entire life. She thought about what her mother had understood about property, about ownership, about what it meant to hold something that was yours in a world that had consistently communicated to women like them that ownership was provisional. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. "I just didn't know it." At 4:15, Victoria came down the hall and stood in the doorway of the small office. Simone looked at her face. "He finished," Victoria said. "Lee, he gave us everything." She paused. The notary's name, the attorney's involvement, the date and participants of the initial conversation in which the Cayman structure and your directorship were planned. Another pause. "And one more thing. Something Lee found in his own files that he hadn't realized he still had." "What?" Simone said. Victoria stepped fully into the room and set a single page on the table. It was an internal memo, dated 5 years and 5 months ago, bearing the Hanul Group's internal header and addressed to 3 senior members of Jae-min's inner circle. It was brief, 7 lines. It outlined the initial parameters of what was described as a strategic financial restructuring, and it referenced in the 4th line the need to establish a holding entity with external directorship to provide liability separation for the group's leadership. The memo was signed, Kang Jae-min's signature, clear, unambiguous. Dated to a period when Simone was still fully embedded in the organization's operations, still believed in the marriage, still 2 months away from the Singapore negotiation that she'd executed on his behalf, while he was already planning her removal. Simone stared at it. She thought about the anniversary gift hitting the floor. She thought about the word papers and the word months and the word prepared. She thought about the letter she'd written in the bank vault and the specific night she'd spent 6 months holding an empire together that had already, in the mind of the man who owned it, begun the process of being transferred away from her. She thought about her mother's handwriting on a deed. She picked up the memo. She held it in both hands and she looked at it for a long time, and Betrayal and Victoria were both very still, and the city outside made its noise, and somewhere across Seoul a man was waiting to find out what she was going to do next. What she did was set the page back down on the table, carefully, the way you set down something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. She looked at Victoria. File everything, she said. Victoria nodded once. All of it. Tomorrow morning, the audio, Lee's deposition, the forensic analysis, the mortgage records, the contribution history, and this. She touched the corner of the memo without picking it up again. All of it at once. Don't sequence it. Don't give him time between filings to respond to one before the next lands. Victoria said, That will be... I know what it will be, Simone said. Do it. The room held that for a moment. Then Victoria picked up her phone and walked out to make the calls that would set the machinery in motion. The irreversible public formal machinery of a legal reckoning that would hit Kang Jae-min's empire on Thursday morning from every direction simultaneously. And there would be no sequencing to respond to, no gap to exploit, no version of the terrain in which he had time to dissolve a structure or relocate an asset or pressure a witness before the next document landed. Simone sat in the small office and listened to the city and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not the cold, deliberate energy of preparation. It was something older and quieter and more absolute than preparation. It was the specific, bone-deep stillness of a woman who has spent everything she has on a single throw and has just let it leave her hands, and now there is nothing left to do but watch it land. Thursday morning came. Victoria's office filed at 9:02. By 9:47, Jae-min's lead attorney had called Victoria's line 4 times. By 10:30, the first financial journalist had the outline of the story. By 11:15, Simone's phone, her actual phone, the one she'd been using again for 2 days, showed 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and 3 from people she did. Former associates of the Hanul group reaching out with the specific, slightly panicked energy of people trying to understand which side of a collapsing structure they were standing on. She answered none of them. She was sitting in Victoria's conference room when the call came in at 11:41 from a number she did not recognize, routed through to Victoria's office line, and Victoria's assistant knocked and said the caller had identified himself as Judge Park Hyun-soo's clerk, and the judge was requesting an emergency session with both parties' lead counsel at 2 p.m. regarding the motion to compel. Victoria looked across the table at Simone. Something in the look said, "This is it." "I'll be ready," Simone said. The session was not a resolution. It was, in legal terms, a hearing on the motion to compel disclosure, Jae-min's attorneys arguing against it with everything they had, Victoria's team presenting the forensic analysis, the deposition summary, the memo, the audio, the full weight of 3 weeks of work compressed into a 2-hour proceeding in a formal hearing room where Kang Jae-min sat at the opposite table in his charcoal suit with his attorney's hand on his arm and his face showing the absolute governance of expression that she had always recognized in him and that she now understood was not strength but the most expensive performance of his life. He looked at her once, across the hearing room, in the specific way that he had only ever looked at her when something had happened that he hadn't controlled, a look she had seen twice in 8 years, and both times had meant that the situation had moved outside the boundaries of his planning. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. And at 3:58 p.m. on a Thursday in November, Judge Park Hyun-soo set down the last document his clerk had handed him, looked at both tables, and said 7 words that landed in the room with the weight of something structural giving way. Judge Park Hyun-soo had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost someone everything. He was 63, gray at the temples, with reading glasses he removed slowly before he spoke, and the 7 words he said landed in the hearing room at 3:58 p.m. on a Thursday in November with the specific structural weight of something that had been holding up a ceiling, finally giving way. The motion to compel is hereby granted. That was all. 7 words, and then the sound of Jae-min's lead attorney exhaling beside him, controlled, professional, but audible, and then the sound of Victoria's pen clicking once against the table, a sound Simone interpreted correctly as the most restrained expression of satisfaction she would ever witness from that woman, and then silence in which the full meaning of what had just happened expanded to fill the room. The Hanul Group's offshore financial architecture, the Cayman entity, Every hidden account, every transferred property, every shell company bearing names that weren't Jaemin's but pointed back to him through 4 layers of legal insulation that Lee Jun-ho had spent 4 hours dismantling in his deposition. All of it was now subject to mandatory disclosure within 30 days, with penalties for noncompliance that Judge Park enumerated with the dry precision of a man who had issued similar orders before and intended this one to be followed. Simone sat at the table and heard every word. She did not look at Jaemin. She had looked at him once, across the room, when the session began. She did not need to look again. The session closed at 4:15. The attorneys gathered their materials with the specific choreography of people who have just survived an enormous amount of pressure and are now processing the outcome through the physical act of organizing papers. Jaemin's team moved quickly, in close formation, the tight efficiency of people who needed to be elsewhere immediately. Jaemin himself stood, buttoned his jacket, one button, the middle, the way he always did, and did not look in her direction. He walked out without looking at her. She watched him go. She felt Brielle's hand on her arm, brief, firm, the kind of contact that doesn't ask anything and doesn't need to. Outside the building, the November air had teeth. Simone stood on the steps with Victoria and Brielle and a junior attorney from Victoria's team who was already typing on his phone, and the city moved around them in its late afternoon register, offices releasing people, traffic thickening, the ordinary velocity of a day ending. "He'll comply," Victoria said. "He doesn't have a choice at this point. Non-compliance with a compelled disclosure motion at this stage with the documented evidence we've established would be, the risk calculation doesn't support it." "How long?" Simone said. "The actual settlement, once disclosure is complete, and asset valuation is properly conducted. 3 to 5 months minimum, possibly longer if he appeals specific valuations." Victoria looked at her steadily. "It will not be fast, it will not be clean. There will be more difficult days before it resolves." "I know. And there will be a period where his attorneys attempt to negotiate a private settlement rather than allow full public disclosure, which gives you a choice about how much of this you want in open court versus resolved quietly." Simone thought about that. She thought about it the way she thought about all the significant things these days. Not immediately, but turning it over, looking at its different faces, trying to understand what was underneath the surface question. "I'll cross that when it comes." Victoria nodded. She picked up her bag. "Go home," she said. "Not Brielle's. Somewhere that's yours. Start thinking about what that looks like." She said it without sentimentality, the way she said everything, but there was something in it that wasn't purely professional. "You've done the hard part." She walked to her car. Simone stood on the steps a moment longer. "Go home." She turned the phrase over. She had not, in any meaningful sense, had a home since the night she'd walked down a stone path past lanterns she'd chosen and through iron gates and out into the October cold. Brielle's spare room had been shelter, practical and essential, and held up by love. But it was not home. The estate in Gangnam was not home anymore. Had not been home, she understood now, for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She thought about what it would mean to make a home that was only hers. The thought did not frighten her. That surprised her a little. The months that followed were not linear. She had wanted them to be, had wanted the legal process to proceed with the clean, satisfying momentum of something already in motion. But the reality of high-stakes litigation involving a man of Jaemin's resources was that it moved in surges and stalls, in sudden accelerations followed by periods of procedural quiet that were more exhausting, in their own way, than the active confrontations. Jaemin's attorneys filed 3 separate objections to the disclosure timeline. Each was reviewed and each was denied with diminishing patience from Judge Park's bench. The forensic document analysis confirming the forged directorship signature was entered into the official record in December, a 30-page report from an independent expert whose credentials Jaemin's team challenged and whose methodology they questioned and whose conclusions they could not ultimately dislodge because the findings were, in the expert's own words during her testimony, unambiguous. The signature was not Simone's. The structural evidence of how it had been produced was documented. The notary whose stamp appeared on the appointment papers was located in January. He was a man named Yu Chang-min, 61 years old, who had retired from his practice 18 months earlier and who, when Victoria's investigator reached him, did not deny what he'd done. He expressed something that Simone, reading the investigator's summary, interpreted as the specific exhaustion of a man who had been carrying knowledge he should not have accepted payment to carry and was relieved in some complicated way to put it down. He agreed to provide a supporting statement. Yu Changmin's statement was submitted to the court in February. By that point, the public dimensions of the case had taken on a life of their own. Financial journalists who covered Korea's corporate landscape had been tracking the compelled disclosure proceedings since December, and the picture that emerged, an offshore structure, a forged directorship, a pattern of asset transfers spanning 4 years, generated the kind of sustained coverage that made business partners and board members nervous in the ways that mattered most to men like Jae-min. Not morally nervous, practically nervous. The kind of nervousness that leads to quiet distance, to unreturned calls, to the gradual redistribution of professional loyalty toward more stable ground. Two of the Hanyul Group's most significant legitimate business partners announced in January that they were reviewing their contractual relationships with the organization. The announcement was bloodlessly corporate in its language and devastating in its practical effect. Simone read about it on a Wednesday morning in the apartment she had rented in Mapogu, 3 blocks from Betrayal, a clean 2-room space on the 8th floor that looked out over a stretch of city that changed color with the light and that she was slowly, deliberately making into something that felt like hers. She had her mother's deed framed on the wall above the desk. She had bought it from the safe deposit box the morning after the Thursday hearing and had it framed the following week, before the apartment had anything else on its walls, because she had decided she wanted that to be the first thing that belonged to the space. She read the news about the business partners and felt something she didn't immediately identify. She sat with it for a moment over her coffee and then recognized it as something close to grief. Not for Jae-min, not for the marriage, but for the organization she had helped build, for the years of work that had created something real and which were now becoming the subject of coverage that reduced it to evidence in a scandal. She had built parts of that organization. Those parts had been real. She allowed herself to feel that for about 4 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and returned to the consulting proposal she'd been drafting for a small tech company looking to expand their Asia-Pacific operations. She had started the work in December. Quietly, without announcement, reached out through her own network. The network she'd maintained independently of the Hanyul Group, the relationships that were hers by virtue of who she was rather than who she'd married. The response had surprised her, though it probably shouldn't have. People who had worked with her over the years remembered the quality of her thinking. They remembered that the strategic mind in certain pivotal meetings had not, in fact, been Jae-min's. Word moved in the way that word moves among people who pay attention to capability. By January, she had 3 active clients. By February, she had registered the business formally, Caldwell Strategic Group, a name she'd arrived at without ceremony, just the simplest statement of what it was. Brielle had cried when she saw the registration documents. Simone had told her to stop, and Brielle had said she'd stop when she was ready, and Simone had gone to the kitchen to make tea and felt something warm and very old move through her chest. The settlement negotiation began in March. Jae-min's attorneys, as Victoria had predicted, pushed hard for a private resolution. The compelled disclosure had by then produced a documented asset picture that differed from the original agreement by, once independent valuation was applied, approximately $94 million. The gap between what he'd offered and what the evidence established as her legitimate share was no longer abstract or arguable. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Simone was present for 2 of the sessions. Victoria had advised against it, had said, professionally and correctly, that her presence complicated the dynamics in ways that weren't strategically useful. But there were 2 specific sessions where Simone had insisted because there were specific things she needed to say in person, with her name attached, with both parties in the room. The first session, she said nothing that wasn't directly responsive to the agenda. She sat at the table and listened and spoke when Victoria indicated she should, and kept her face composed and professional, and gave Jae-min's attorneys nothing to work with in terms of the emotional temperature of the room. Jae-min was not present at those sessions. His attorneys represented him. He requested the second session where she was present. His attorney made the request through Victoria, framing it as a desire to discuss certain terms directly. Victoria had recommended against it. Simone had said yes. He came in and sat down and looked at her. She looked back. The attorneys gave them the room for 10 minutes at Jae-min's request. This was unusual, and Victoria agreed to it with visible reluctance. And for 10 minutes, Simone sat across a conference table from the man she had been married to for 8 years and looked at what those 8 years and the subsequent months had done to the space between them. He looked older. Not dramatically. He was still formidable, still carried the specific gravity that had always defined him. But there were lines around his eyes that she didn't remember, and a quality of heaviness in the set of his shoulders that was new. He was 50 years old, and for the first time in all the years she'd known him, he looked like a man carrying weight rather than a man who had decided weight didn't apply to him. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The Singapore deal?" He said it without preamble, without the scaffolding of approach she might have expected. Just the words, direct, like he'd been holding them for a specific moment, and this was it. "I want you to know that I understood, when you came back from Singapore, what you had done, what it cost you, the pressure you were under, and the decision you made to close it without asking for anything from me in return." She held his gaze, said nothing. "I told myself it didn't matter," he said, "that the organization needed what it needed and you were capable of delivering it, and that was enough. I told myself that was a form of respect." He looked at his hands, briefly, then back at her. "I understood. When I was watching the disclosure documents come out, when I was reading the record of what you contributed and what I had done with that contribution, I understood that I had been lying to myself about what I thought of you." "What did you think of me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were indispensable," he said, "and I treated indispensable like a category instead of a person." The room held that. "That's probably the most honest thing you've said to me in 5 years, she said. Something crossed his face. "Yes." "It doesn't change anything. I know. Not the settlement, not the forgery, not the 3 years, not the 5 years of planning before the 3 years. She kept her voice even. She was not, in this moment, angry. She had moved through the anger and out the other side into something that was simply clear. "I want you to understand that I'm not sitting here waiting for an apology that would make any of this different, because there isn't one." "Huh? I know that too," he said. "Good." She looked at him, one of those full, direct looks that she'd stopped giving herself permission to do for too long and had since reclaimed as her own. "I built something real. Parts of what you have were built by me. That's in the record now. It's documented and attested, and it will exist as part of what this organization's history actually was, regardless of how the next few years go." She paused. "That's what I came to say in person. Not for you. For the record." Jae-min looked at her for a long moment. "The woman I married," he said quietly, "would have needed me to acknowledge that." "Yes," she said. "She would have." She picked up her pen and set it back down. "The woman sitting here doesn't need anything from you," she said. "That's the difference." The attorneys came back at 10 minutes exactly. The settlement was finalized in April. The terms were not public. Both parties had agreed to confidentiality provisions that Victoria had reviewed with surgical care, ensuring that nothing in the confidentiality agreement prevented Simone from discussing her own professional history or contributions, only the specific financial terms of the resolution. The number was not what the full picture might have justified in an unencumbered proceeding. There were costs, the counter-allegation defense, the months of litigation, the complexity of the offshore structure, even after compelled disclosure. And what Simone walked away with was not every number that could have appeared in a different version of this story. It was enough. More than enough to capitalize the consulting business properly, to secure the Mapo-gu apartment through the end of the following year, and to put something aside in an account that bore only her name, untouched and ungoverned by anyone else's decisions. The night the settlement was signed, she went to Brielle's apartment. Not because she needed to. She had her own space now, with her mother's deed on the wall and 3 clients and a business registration and her own kettle, and the specific, unglamorous satisfaction of knowing that everything in that apartment was there because she put it there. She went because Brielle had been there at 11:40 on an October night when Simone had nothing except her dignity and the beginning of something she couldn't name yet, and she wanted to sit across from her at that kitchen table one more time and let the weight of the past 6 months settle between them in the way that only happens when you are with someone who saw the whole thing. Brielle opened the door before she knocked. She must have heard the elevator. She looked at Simone's face, and what she saw there made her step forward and put her arms around her, and Simone stood in the doorway of Brielle's apartment and let herself be held for the count of several breaths, which was more than she'd allowed herself in a long time. Then she stepped back, and they went to the kitchen table, and Brielle put the kettle on without being asked. They sat for a while without talking. "How do you feel?" Brielle said eventually. Simone thought about it honestly. "Like someone who survived a building collapse," she said. "Not triumphant, not destroyed. Just standing in the open air and relearning what regular breathing feels like." Brielle looked at her. "That's enough for today." "Yes," she said. "It is." Caldwell's strategic group opened its formal office space in June. Not a large space. 3 rooms in a building in Mapogu, clean-lined and deliberately simple, with a conference table that seated 8 and a view of the city that changed character with the weather. Simone had chosen it herself, on a Tuesday morning in May, walking through 3 options with a real estate agent who had no idea who she was or what she'd spent the past 8 months doing, and she had stood in this particular space by the window for a long moment and felt something she recognized from a long time ago, from before everything she'd spent on someone else's vision had accumulated into the weight it became. She felt like she was choosing something that was going to be hers. The business grew the way she had expected it to, steadily, on the foundation of her actual work rather than her proximity to someone else's name. She brought on a research associate in July, a young Korean-American woman named Ji-soo, who was sharper than she let on, and who reminded Simone in certain moments of herself at that age before she'd learned to make herself smaller in certain rooms. She told Ji-soo explicitly, in their 3rd week of working together, that there was no room in this organization for making herself smaller. Ji-soo had looked at her and said she understood, and Simone had believed her. The conference in Singapore was in September. She had not been back since the negotiation she'd closed for Jimin 11 years ago, and she had registered for this one, an Asia-Pacific business strategy convening that drew senior consultants and corporate leaders from across the region, without letting herself think too much about the particular resonance of the location. It was practically speaking a useful conference. That was the beginning and end of the consideration. She was in the hotel lobby on the 2nd evening of the conference, moving toward the elevator after a session that had run 30 minutes over, when a man she didn't know said her name. "Ms. Caldwell?" She turned. He was Korean-American, early 40s, with the specific kind of ease that came not from the absence of difficulty, but from having moved through enough of it to stop bracing against the next wave. He introduced himself as Ethan Park. He led a technology company she'd heard of, not in the Hanul Group context, in the regular business world, the kind of company that appeared in legitimate coverage for legitimate reasons. He said he'd attended her morning session on cross-market entry strategy and had a question about a point she'd made regarding regulatory asymmetry in Southeast Asian markets. It was a good question. She answered it honestly and in some depth, standing in the hotel lobby while the conference traffic moved around them. And he listened with the quality of attention that meant he was actually processing rather than waiting for a pause to speak. And they ended up in the lobby bar for another 40 minutes, working through the 2nd and 3rd implications of the point his question had raised. He did not ask about the Hanul Group. He did not ask about her marriage. He asked about her methodology and her framework and her view on a specific regulatory question in the Vietnamese market, and when they finally said goodnight at the elevator banks, it was past 11, and Simone walked to her room and stood at the window looking out at Singapore's nighttime harbor, and felt something she took a moment to identify. She was interested. Not in him specifically, not yet. That was too fast, and she was not a woman who moved from too fast in any direction anymore. But interested in the possibility of something, in the existence of a man who had spent an evening asking what she thought without ever once positioning himself relative to it, who had listened without agenda. It was a small thing. It was not small at all. They exchanged contact information at breakfast the following morning, professionally, with the easy practicality of 2 people who found each other's thinking useful and saw no reason to be obscure about it. He emailed 2 days after she returned to Seoul, a follow-up on the regulatory question with a link to a recent analysis, no preamble, no performance. She responded with 3 points of her own and a counter-argument on his second assertion. He responded within the hour. "You're right about the second one. I've been arguing it wrong for a year." She smiled at her screen. It was the beginning of something, though she was in no hurry to name it. She had learned, at considerable cost, that the things worth having took the time they took, and that the right response to something good beginning was not to accelerate it out of hunger, but to let it grow at the pace of its own nature. She went about her work. The months turned. The consulting business moved into its second year with 4 full-time clients and a waiting list that Simone had not anticipated, and which Jisoo managed with a quiet, organized satisfaction that Simone recognized as the particular pleasure of someone who is exactly where they're supposed to be doing exactly what they're good at. They hired a second researcher in the spring. They expanded the conference room. The Hanul group continued in its diminished form. Jimin remained at its head, but the organization was smaller, quieter, and the particular aura of untouchability that had characterized it in its peak years had been, if not destroyed, fundamentally altered. He did not contact her. She did not contact him. There were no loose threads. Everything that had existed between them, the agreements and the grievances and the documented history and the specific accountable record of who had built what and who had taken what and what had been done with her name without her knowledge, all of it was in the court record, complete, attested, and resolved. The notary Yu Chang-min had given his statement. Lee Jun-ho had given his deposition. The forensic expert had given her report. The judge had given his order. And Simone had given 8 months of her life and a forensic accounting of 8 years before that to the process of making sure that the story of what had actually happened was the story that existed in the record, not the story that would have existed if she had signed the first set of papers without looking carefully. She thought about that sometimes, about what would have happened if she had signed. $21 million and her mother's contribution buried in a man's version of history. The Cayman structure active, her name on it, a trap that was patient enough to wait years before it needed to spring. She had not signed. A year after the settlement, Simone went to Itaewon on a Wednesday afternoon when her schedule had a gap. She went back to the bank. She sat in the same small private room in the vault where she'd retrieved the documents that had helped build her case, and she sat there for a few minutes in the quiet, in the particular smell of climate-controlled air that made everything in it feel preserved. She had brought the letter, the one she'd written to herself during the 6 months she'd spent holding Jaemin's operation together with personal funds and strategic force of will. She read it one more time, her own younger handwriting slightly different from what it was now, the certainty in every line of a woman who believed so completely in what she was building alongside someone else that the cost of building it felt like an investment rather than a loss. She folded it. She put it back in the box. She kept it there, not as evidence, not anymore, but as something else, a record of who she had been, a woman who believed that completely, who sacrificed that completely, who was wrong in the specific and costly way that people are wrong when they give everything to someone else's vision and call it a shared one. She had been that woman. She was not ashamed of her. She was simply not her anymore. On the first anniversary of Caldwell Strategic Group's formal opening, Simone held a small dinner. 7 people, Brielle, Jisoo, the 2 researchers, and 3 clients who had become something closer to colleagues over the course of their work together. She did not give a speech. She opened the wine and they sat around the conference table that she had chosen herself in a building that bore her name and ate food she'd ordered from a restaurant that Jisoo had picked. And they talked about work and about the year and about what was coming next. At the end of the evening, after everyone had gone, Simone sat alone at the conference table for a few minutes with the last of her wine. She looked at the table, the room, the view of the city through the window, which in the late evening was all lit architecture and the specific beauty of a large city at rest, going about its business without reference to any one person's story. She thought about the stone path, the lanterns from Kyoto, the anniversary gift hitting the floor, the feeling of a man she loved looking at her like a problem he'd finally decided to address. She thought about the recording device, the hearing room, the 7 words. She thought about her mother's deed on the wall. She thought about Ethan Park in Singapore and the email exchange that had continued past the regulatory question into other territory, comfortable, unhurried, The particular pleasure of two people who found each other's minds interesting and were in no rush about the rest of it. She thought about the woman who had walked down that stone path in October with nothing but her dignity and something coming loose inside her that she hadn't understood yet. That woman had not known what she was. She knew now. She finished her wine. She stood, turned off the conference room lights, and walked through the office she had built, past Jisoo's desk with its careful stacks of research files, past the whiteboard where she'd mapped 3 client strategies in her own handwriting, past the framed registration document on the wall near the entrance that read Caldwell Strategic Group in clean black type. She picked up her coat, her bag. She locked the door behind her. She took the elevator down and walked out into the night air of Seoul, which was warm now, summer coming, the city bright and indifferent and full of people living lives that had nothing to do with her story. And she walked toward the subway with her hands in her coat pockets and her shoulders loose and the particular ease in her body of a woman who is going somewhere she chose. Not away from anything, toward something. That was the difference, she thought. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not the settlement, and not the court record, and not the documented history, or the business registration, or anything that had been won or taken back or proven. Just this. The difference between a woman moving away from someone else's idea of her life and a woman moving toward her own. She went down into the subway station. The train came. She got on.